Being a warrior in a contemporary context doesn't mean fighting all the time. It means, how do you navigate the system? How do we be a statesman? How do we bring people along with us?
Well, that's it exactly. And I'm a big believer that leadership is about identity work.
Leadership is about how you bring yourself and how you bring people on that journey.
Today, I'm joined by Brendan Moyle. Brendan's a proud Gomeroi, Kamilaroi man with over 25 years experience across the public service and Aboriginal organizations, including senior executive roles at the Commonwealth and the ACT levels. He's now the executive director of the New South Wales Aboriginal Language Trust. He's grounded in both systems and community. He's got a strong sense of where leadership can really make a difference. And today I wanted to step back from those roles and just spend some time understanding the man, the person behind this leadership. Brendan, it's really great to have you here.
Thanks, James. It's an honour to be here with you. If you don't mind, I'll just say a couple of things in language. Yama milie, yamagata ningada. It's, our language group is the Gomeroi language group, which is where Kamilaroi, Gomeroi, all those phonetic pronunciations actually comes from. What I just said was, hello, my friend. Welcome, everybody. I really want to acknowledge country. I want to acknowledge my ancestors, not just my direct ancestors, but the elders that I was privileged enough to learn from over the last 50 odd years of my life. I pay my respects to my ancestors who, without the lessons that they passed down, without the journey that they walked, I wouldn't be who I am. I pay my respects to my elders. I pay my respects as well to country, culture, law. Kinship comes from country, and I want to pay my respects to the country and the ancestors at a land where everyone that's watching this is actually sitting. It's important because I know that there's a discussion across Australia right now about, well, why should we be welcome to our country? We're not welcoming or acknowledging Australia. We're actually acknowledging something that goes back 65,000 years. When you think about Europe from a technical construct, you don't get welcomed to the European Union. The European Union operates as a whole and is made up of different nations. And within those different nations, there are different provinces. Languages are shared. Austrians speak German, but they're not German. Here in Aboriginal Australia, we have Guris, Murris, Noongars, Kuris. Much like people have Nordic people, Slavic people, Gaelic people, Anglo-Saxons. We have different genotypes. We have different nations based around that. And so for me, it's important to actually recognise that in acknowledging country, I'm acknowledging those ancestral connections to country. I'm acknowledging the legacy that those ancestors have left that we see when we drive down a highway, when we look at a mountain range, when we see, without even realising, the creation stories that date back before the beginning of time.
When I grew up back in the States, I don't remember a single acknowledgement to the Potawatomi or the Shoshone or the Cheyenne. But when I came here to Australia, I experienced some amazing welcomes from traditional owners, as well as some really good acknowledgements from non-traditional owners. It kind of impressed me with something actually, this is something that matters. I think before we talk about the roles and your experience, I'd love just to start a bit more personally. Who is Brendan outside of the work? What is it that keeps you grounded?
It's a really profound question. From an Aboriginal perspective, we often talk about walking two worlds, and we all do it. We have to walk within an institutional or a societal structure as well as a contemporary cultural structure. Who I am, though, I've got mixed ancestry. My mother's non-Indigenous. My dad was a proud Gomeroi, Kamilaroi man. Who am I? I didn't finish school. I started with no education. I didn't even have a HSC. And, I did various jobs around. And then in my probably mid-20s, I started as a trainee at the very bottom in Housing New South Wales. So no education, trainee. I'd had times when we had a level of affluence. People might say we were middle class at times. There are other times where I remember living in a tent under a shed. I remember at this point, I have four sisters, and mum and dad, had lost everything and lived in this tiny two-bedroom place. As the only boy, I basically lived in a garden shed. I remember being homeless. I remember, for me, I could have been one of those statistics that we talk about. The reason I wear glasses today is because, my mum and dad and my grandmother wanted me to get a good education. Now, I tend to go really dark in the sun, and I got sent to a school. And when they realised why I went so dark and what our family name, the Aboriginal family names were connected to are, I got jumped and I got bashed. Now, they broke down through here on me. And from that day forward, I've had to wear glasses. Again, I don't look at it and go, boohoo, poor me. But society has changed. I am grateful. My daughters do not have to experience that.
Yeah.
What I experienced was a fraction of what my grandmother experienced. But it was power and strength with my grandmother. My grandmother was probably and remains the most influential person in my life. Through
Wow.
adversity and hardship, she rose with strength and
Mm.
integrity and wisdom, as many of our elders did. It was the elders that I was blessed to learn from, that saw something in me, that invested their wisdom and their experiences. I count myself extremely fortunate to have learnt from some of the most amazing people who built the systems on both sides. And in understanding the systems of government, I pay my respects. I have met and had some of the most amazing non-Indigenous mentors who
Mm.
became friends and colleagues,
Mm. Mm.
who again saw something in me and invested their time in me.
I remember you once told me that you focus on the strengths of community and that
Mhm.
the movements that we see today really are that legacy of the elders. It kind of struck a chord with me.
You and I were talking just on the weekend. I was up back in Moyle seeing one of my elders, Lily Mo. Uncle Lily Mo, if you're there, I'm giving you a shout out. But you know, he was at the cutting edge in the starting of the Aboriginal Legal Service. He was at the cutting edge of the Black Rights Movement. He showed me photos of he and Uncle Paul Coe meeting with Muhammad Ali, meeting with the leader of Sinn Féin, you know, trying to work out in the 70s and 80s, how do we as Aboriginal people grasp the strength and how do we actually move forward from oppression into not equality, but equity?
Yeah.
Because equality is when you get the same access. Equity is when the disadvantages that have been created historically are removed. And, you know, I pay my respects to his father, Uncle Lyle Munro Sr., who, you know, I remember sitting on his front porch. I remember sitting with him in Wollongong, listening to him, talking to him. And I remember learning from people like Uncle Solly Balia, who, you know, introduced Paul Keating at the Redfern Park speech in 1992, you know, went over to America, lived with the Black Panther movement,
Mm.
learnt from them and brought those learnings back. But the one thing I actually learnt from them was that being a warrior in a contemporary context doesn't mean fighting all the time. It means how do you navigate the system? Sometimes we have to be forthright. We have to stand in our strength and integrity. But so many times it's about how do we be a statesman? How do we bring people along with us? My time when I go out into the bush, the time when I reconnect, the time when I do those things, you know, that for me anchors me and grounds me. I
Mm.
love the jobs that I do. There's so many amazing people I've met. There's been some not great experiences as well. However, though, my anchor will always be our people. My anchor will always be having the privilege to sit and listen and learn from people. Even now that I'm in my 50s, I still sit and I listen. I still
Yeah.
sit and I reflect on the things that might have been told me 20 or 30 years ago.
You introduced me to the Redfern speech, and I was aware of so many of the different civil rights and human rights champions coming from the States. But coming here, really, I knew the Mabo decision. I knew of that story. When the apology took place, I made sure my parents came out from the States. My grandfather, who was quite influential in my life, was there. And I said, we need to listen to this. But then when you showed me the Redfern speech, I thought, oh my gosh, looking at all the people that you've met that have been setting
Mm.
up health services, legal services, it's so impressive. You have such a strong connection to community. And is that what drew you to the public service?
Yes, it was also the belief, though, that I have an obligation as a human.
Yeah.
I have a cultural obligation by the time I leave this world to have done what I can to make it a better place. I drew on my experiences, some of the hardships that I'd experienced, some of the people that I knew that I'm friends with that they'd experienced, to try and reframe services and policies so that what was happening no longer happened again. And it was interesting when I started as a trainee. It was about, great, I get paid, I get a job, but I get to help people. And, you know, in my mid 20s, 26, 27 years ago now, that was about how do I get better outcomes for people? Now, that core belief has stayed the same. Just as I grew, my sphere of influence and understanding also grew. And so rather than actually changing individual outcomes now, I try to change systems. And the will is there. For people working within government, how many government agreements have we got to have that change the way we work? It comes down, even though I look at systems, people operate within those systems, whether you
Yeah.
be at the front counter of a service delivery or entity, or whether you be running policies or a national organisation. People count.
When you first entered the public sector, what was one of the big challenges that you encountered?
Stereotypes.
Yeah.
I go to the gym a lot. Part of that was because some of my own experiences as a child, I always swore that I'd never be vulnerable again. Part of that was about my own psychological safety and protection, and then it just filled through into the rest of my life. It was interesting, probably the stereotypes. I turned up, and I remember talking to my father at the time. He said, "Hey, how's work going, son?" And I said, "Yeah, look, here's this, and this," and about some of the people, would look down their nose. "Oh, you're a trainee. You're at the bottom of the food chain. You're an Aboriginal person." And it's that institutional discrimination. It's a societal
Yeah.
discrimination. And I remember my dad saying, "Didn't they think black fellas could be smart?" And of course, once I'd sucked in my teeth into things, that'd change. That was the greatest thing that I actually found that started to inform my position. The other thing which I actually learned very, very early on, and it was a non-Indigenous leader that again invested time in me. He said, "Brendan, the only consistency in government is change. If you can adapt and change while still understanding what the overarching intent is, you can succeed. Governments change positions. Governments change. Bureaucracies change. Machinery, government changes, new secretaries, all of those things. The key is for me how we remain flexible and adaptable enough to navigate those changes with integrity, still being able to deliver while maintaining the uniqueness of who we actually are." I keep saying to people that we need frameworks and systems to promote reconciliation. We need society to promote reconciliation. But true reconciliation starts with connections between people.
Well, that's it exactly. Leadership is about identity
Mm.
work. And so if you're a leader in any one of these systems, definitely look at the structures and the systems, but look at what's the value you want to bring to the world and how is that manifesting in who you are. These things are so important when you're looking at what's the change that needs to happen. You're there to support people.
And you're right. What you've articulated, though, is that so many people mistake management for leadership.
Yeah. Yeah.
Management is the administration of systems and processes.
And that's important.
It's a critical part, particularly the higher you go. Leadership is about how you bring yourself and how you bring people on that journey. It's interesting, the Maxwell Institute has this saying that I absolutely love. If you're truly a leader and you turn around and you look around and there's nobody with you, are you really leading or are you just taking a walk by yourself?
Yep.
And for me, that reverberates from a leadership context, but from a cultural context as well. The historical records actually said that Aboriginal culture was the world's truest democracy. There was no king, there was no chief. People worked together. And this is where the cultural paradigm, when we operate through that in terms of leadership, leadership is not about giving directions. Leadership is about bringing people on that journey.
Yes.
Maybe still knowing roughly where you're going to. From a leadership perspective, one of the things that I quite often reflect on that the historic failings of closing the gap, whether it be the national agreement, National Indigenous Reform Agreement, which was signed in 2008, or the current 2020 agreement, every year it's reported failure, 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 failure. And part of the challenge for us is that from a Western perspective, management and administration says, we've got a target, we're going to run straight for that target. Leadership thinks, how do I get to that target? From an Aboriginal perspective, when I look at the current National Agreement on Closing the Gap and the priority reforms, and they were embedded in the original National Indigenous Reform Agreement further back in the document, they start to map out how we should walk. And so from an Aboriginal perspective, I often say that the journey is more important than the destination. Because if you don't follow the right path, you don't end up at the right place. You might know where you're trying to get to, but it's how you walk, how you tread as a leader, how you walk with people, regardless whether you're Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander or you're non-Indigenous. It's how you walk with people, the integrity that you show, that is critical. And this is where when you actually look at the current National Agreement on Closing the Gap, the first of the priority reforms is formal partnerships and shared decision making. The challenge remains the imbalance of power within the systems. Like I said, I've had experiences throughout my career and through my life that I really wish I didn't have to have, but that's informed who I am today. By and large, most people are really good people. The challenge for us when we actually talk about whether it be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, whether it be any kind of multiculturalism, is that human nature to think through an ethnocentric lens. So it's human nature for us to assess every situation based on our own cultural paradigms, what we learnt from being a child, our education, everything informs and shapes that. Now, when you are operating in a system that is dominated by a specific kind of culture, any of the heavily colonized nations now, where the First Nations people are a relatively small portion of those people, it's that majority culture that was embedded 200, 300, 400 years ago that still permeates today. And it permeates in terms of the way the systems are constructed. It also permeates in terms of the way that people think.
Yeah.
And you see that pervading. The challenge for us is to think through a cultural relativistic lens because we're not all the same.
Yeah.
And quite often we might be talking about similar things, but we're not using the same language. It's also actually realizing, where do we hold the balance of power? Because institutions hold, through a societal structure or an economic structure, hold the balance of power. If you're signing off on the money, if you're signing off on the resources, if you're signing off on the policies or legislation, you hold power. But how do you rebalance that power to make sure that you create space, not just for people to be heard, but to be actively engaged and to shape and inform things? Now, one of the things I quite often talk about, if we actually look again through the lens of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, any service area needs to have the voices of those who are the beneficiaries of those services, not just providing feedback, but being instrumental in the shaping of policies. Why is that important? Because it means that you actually capture that knowledge and you're able to deliver services that respond to the needs of those people. That has an economic impact if we actually think purely through a fiscal perspective. And this is where the systemic discrimination comes into the conversation. If it comes to people with disability, we listen. Because society is geared to go, I know people with disability. I've got some people living with disability in my family. And so what we see is people with lived experience of disability, either as carers or with their own experiences, being drawn into those business areas, being able to actually shape the policies and programs that respond to those needs. You know, the NDIS was established based on the legitimate voices of those people. But imagine how effective that would be if there was only a minority of people with disability in that space. Conversely, and I mean absolutely no disrespect, I recall back when Tony Abbott announced that he was not just the Prime Minister, but he was the Minister for Women. Remember the outcry? Yeah. Imagine if the Office of Women was largely staffed by men. How effective would the policies be? Imagine if men turn around and the Office of Women, largely staffed by women, put forward a policy position. Men sat back and went, no, we don't like that. Where's the balance of power? What is the impact, the societal and financial impact on the loss of that balance of power? It means those that are struggling with the level of vulnerability, those that are struggling with disadvantage, the policies and programs and investments aren't actually meeting their needs.
If you're not listening and having them involved in what needs to be done,
100%.
How can you, hand on heart, say that you know that? You can't.
I think it was Charlie Perkins that once said, the path of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander policy in Australia has been paved with good intentions.
That was the shield behind the stolen generation, wasn't it?
Exactly. Stolen generation, but also the protector of Aborigines. You go back to the mid-1800s, the protector of Aborigines. You know, we couldn't protect ourselves. And some of the greatest atrocities, stolen generation was one of them. But when you even look at stolen wages, and people have heard a little bit about stolen wages. Now, it's predominantly in Queensland, but there are stolen wages across Australia. What a lot of people don't realise was that stolen wages was a concept that was actually put in under the protection of Aborigines. Now, what that allowed was that Aboriginal people could get a permit to go and work and earn an income, not be used as slave labour. Because there was historical record showing that people were actually threatening to kill or harm the families of the men if they didn't go and work. And these are the kinds of conversations we need to have from a truth-telling perspective. It's not that it's directly affecting us today, but it's the historical construct. So firstly, there wasn't wage equality. I think that Aboriginal people were only being paid about 20 to 25% of what non-Indigenous workers were. Of that 20 to 25%, they only got a small percentage of that for themselves. The rest of it was held in trust. Now, being held in trust, those monies were then diverted to run the missions and fund the removal of children. Stolen generation. And this is where, again, Charlie Perkins actually said once, we can't live in the past, but our past lives in us. And we can't live in the past, but if we don't acknowledge the past, then how do we make sure that we're not making the same mistakes and creating irreparable damage?
This isn't pretty stuff to look at, but that's what needs to happen to have conversations like this, right?
Absolutely.
Where we're talking about this should not ever happen again.
Absolutely. And, the exact issue might not be happening again, but, some of the issues that we still face,
Mm,
when I was living in Canberra last, for me as an Aboriginal leader within an institution and recognised within community, to turn up to an event and find out that those same institutions had pushed Aboriginal staff to suicidal ideations, and a young Aboriginal staff member had been admitted to hospital with suicidal ideations. And you're looking, going, hang on 2 seconds. You're meant to have reconciliation action plans. You're meant to have these things. You're meant to be doing cultural awareness training. How does this happen in an era where 2008 National Indigenous Reform Agreement closing the gap, 2020 National Agreement closing the gap? How does this happen? And it's because people, they're thinking through an ethnocentric perspective, and it's that deep underlying issue. Now, this was in a jurisdiction that was the only one that voted yes for the referendum, but the voices internally and the experience of Aboriginal people weren't commensurate with that yes vote, whether it be staff in institutions being pushed to the point of suicidal ideations, being dismissed and diminished. I was the head of Aboriginal Affairs. We'd gotten another report that highlighted yet again the failures. I remember someone actually saying to me, and they weren't trying to be nasty, and they looked at me and said, well, I don't mean any disrespect, but what's the worst thing that's going to happen if we don't close the gap? And I'm looking at it going, you're responsible for managing me. You're responsible for managing Aboriginal affairs. And I get that that person isn't a bad person. They weren't coming from a bad place, but it shows the systemic discrimination. But then there's also no consideration given to the Aboriginal people who are sitting back going, oh my God. And this is where I keep coming back to who I am as a person. We need to stop feeling bad and start acting. And that acting starts with the little relationships.
yeah.
There are people in the Aboriginal community who have the answers. They can show you what to do. Ironically, they've actually worked with governments who have signed agreements in cabinet that say what to do.
Yeah. That's right.
So if you're not going to do it because you're a good person, do your job. You are legally required to do it. Look, I would much rather bring people along on that journey. There are some people that you can't bring along, and that's part of society, regardless what community it is. But the reality is, though, it all starts with those little relationships. It starts with touching the mind through knowledge, and then touching the heart by seeing people. Oh, I don't see Brendan Moyle as an Aboriginal person. I see Brendan Moyle as a friend. I see you as a professional who
Yes.
happens to be an Aboriginal person. And what you bring as an Aboriginal person to that dynamic adds the richness
Yes.
and the value that you bring to society, that you bring to an institution. If we start with those little things, the world
Yeah.
can change. One of my elders shared this story with me, and I still reckon he was talking about himself. He used to be on the National Aborigines Conference, the NAC, which was prior to ATSIC. He was the chair of the NAC when the first time ever that an Aboriginal delegation actually met with an Australian cabinet. It was the Fraser government in 1980. I said, I'm blessed to have learnt from some of these people. And, he set up institutions. He sat on institutions. And I'm glad I'm wearing tinted glasses because I'm kind of holding back a few tears at the same time, because this is someone I truly idolise and that I had the pleasure of knowing and learning from. He actually said, there was this young Murray fella, went out to change the world, went overseas and did all these things. And he said, a little bit of traction, but not much changed. And I thought to myself, you're talking about yourself, uncle, because, in the 60s and 70s, he'd gone to the United Nations. He'd been pulled off planes by the AFP or by the police because he dared to stay in protests on trying to get to the United Nations. He was there with Burnham when they actually put the Aboriginal flag on the Pebbly Beach in England to claim England. And he said, we got a little bit of traction, but it didn't make the changes we actually needed. So he came back and he thought, no, I'm going to try and change Australia. A little bit more traction. Did some really good things, but again, things were still not happening at the pace that we needed it. So he decided, I'm going to try and change New South Wales. Came back. And each time he came back, there was a little bit more traction. And then, as he was an old man, he sat there and he stopped and he went, I've done all these amazing things, but we still see racism. We still see all the issues that he was fighting against 60, 70 years beforehand. And that's when he went, to change the world, I need to change my own backyard. I need to look at the influence I create in my hometown, with my family, with our friends. And, you know, for me, that's really profound. And from a reverse engineering perspective, the profoundness of that is that if we really want to change the world, we need to start with our own spheres of influence. Every human being is a leader in their own rights. When we're born and we're children, who do we look up to? Doesn't matter if they're unemployed, doesn't matter if they're the Prime Minister, doesn't matter if they're driving garbage trucks. We look to our parents, our aunties, our uncles, like you said, your grandfather, like me, my grandmother. The influence that we can create on our children, on our nieces and nephews, the influence that we can create with the people we cross paths with, that we build relationships with. And you imagine if we had 1,000 of us, right, that were saying, right, we're highly committed to changing Australia, and that 1,000 people influenced 100 people each over the next year. 100 people to influence and share knowledge with isn't hard in a year or 2 years or 10 years. But you imagine the profound shifts in society that we actually see. And that's why I'm a firm believer that we do need the systems to hold accountability. We need the systems to drive that change. We need the systems to give the instruction. This is what you need to do. But at the heart of it comes leadership, becomes who we are as people. At the heart of it comes sitting down, having a cup of coffee with someone, going, hey, sharing knowledge and stories, building those relationships as friends. If we can't do that, nothing else happens. For me, when we look at 2023 referendum for an Indigenous voice, it wasn't that hard. It's smart. Bring in people that are actually the beneficiaries of the services to help them actually influence the delivery of services. Not that hard. Australia resoundingly voted no. But what was different to that and the 1967 referendum that actually counted us in the census and enacted the race power that allowed legislative instruments to be put in place at 90.6% yes vote, it was the highest yes vote of any referendum in the history of Australia. At a time, 2 years after the Freedom Rides, you know, white activists, non-Indigenous activists with us were run off the road. People watch Mississippi burning. That happened at Walgett. That happened at Moyle. It happened at Kempsey. But 2 years later, we had the most resounding yes vote. What was different? It was the relationship. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Indigenous people working together. I encourage people to Google, you know, some of the images. One of it, and there's this beautiful picture, is this little Murray kid walking down the street holding hands with a non-Indigenous kid. You know, for me, that is the difference. We didn't do it in 2023. What we did was we came from an institutional perspective. And any time there is an advocacy movement, it reverberates back to that old adage that, oh my God, they're going to take our backyards, they're going to take our homes. It's never happened. Conversely, though, as well, that when I look at it, what it highlighted is something I firmly believe. Since the impact of colonisation or invasion, we as Aboriginal people have not achieved anything within the broader institution of Australia that has changed the nation without our non-Indigenous allies, without our friends. And for me, that's why I keep believing that we need to touch the heart.
Yeah.
When you actually look at the referendum in 1967, we were less than 1% of the population. Could we get 90%, 90.6% of the vote? That was non-Indigenous people who stood there and went, actually, you know what? I've had the chance to build this relationship. I've had the chance to actually talk and listen and understand. And this isn't right. They stood by us. When I look, and this one's a really challenging one, the Moyle Creek Massacre in the mid-1800s, you know, the elder I was talking to was a living descendant of the survivors of that massacre. And it was on Gomeroi country, Gomeroi country. What had happened was a non-Indigenous property manager had taken his Aboriginal friends out. They were all working together and they were droving cattle. And a whole heap of non-Indigenous farmers decided to massacre 28 Aboriginal people, elders, kids, women. I won't go into the details, but if people want to know, it was barbaric, beyond barbaric. They were doing things so they wouldn't waste bullets. That non-Indigenous property manager was so appalled by what happened. He rode into the nearest town. He was dismissed. So he got on his horse from northern New South Wales and rode all the way to Sydney. And you imagine back then, I mean, I drove back up there on the weekend. And it was a 7-hour drive by car. You imagine how long it would have taken, and that non-Indigenous property manager, lobbied and lobbied and lobbied. The first case was dismissed. He managed to do so much lobbying. The second case was heard and they were found guilty. Why it was so profound, and it is etched into Australia's memory, because it was the first time ever non-Indigenous people were convicted and executed for massacring Aboriginal people. Now that in itself is a cornerstone and a landmark within Australian history. But there's something else that actually rings true to me. He didn't do that because he just wanted to be a good person. He did that because he saw the pain on his friends' faces. He felt the pain of those that he rode with, those that he ate with, those that became part of his extended family. What I keep advocating, it's the little relationships. Would he have done that if he didn't count those people as his friends? And the answer to me is no. And so there is an example almost 200 years ago that one individual changed the course of a nation because he said, this isn't right, and these people I care about. And that's where, for me, if we are truly leaders, that leadership starts with the relationships. It starts with bringing people along on that journey with us.
Far out. I didn't know that, Brendan.
Mm.
We need to care about each other as humans. And that's where these conversations help, because they just build that connection.
Part of the challenge I think that we've got when it comes to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs is we've got so many reports, whether it be the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, the National Indigenous Reform Agreement, God knows how many Senate inquiries and everything else, not just at an Australian government level, but across all jurisdictions. They keep telling us one thing: we're failing. The system needs change. And the challenge for us remains that for people to be promoted through the system, they've got to master a system that all of these reports over 20, 30 years tell us isn't working. And so this is where the systemic leadership is actually required. From an Aboriginal perspective, I remember hearing when I was young, and I think John Pilger actually said something very similar in a 1988 documentary, that Aboriginal culture was identified as the world's truest democracy. There was no king, there was no queen, there was no chief. You had people come together, and the strength of the survival of community was based on the diversity that was actually there, and not shutting down that diversity. It was actually embracing what that diversity means, because diversity is fundamentally about diversity of thought. Now, gender diversity is about diversity of thought. It's wrapped up in gender. Ageism is about diversity of thought. The experiences that people who've got that lived experience bring in to help inform the policy settings. Disability, migrants, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. The strength and the ability for us to succeed is based on our willingness to embrace diversity of thought in a changing environment. Now, sometimes that diversity of thought comes from inside because we directly recruit, but we can't just actually do things in an insular way. Those people, whether it be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff within the institutions or any other cohort, are representative. They're not there to represent. They're representative to build the policy settings so that we can build relationships. They should never transplant or remove the need and the right for those community experts to be able to have their voices heard. But again, the diversity of that thought process, the diversity of a dissenting view can be harnessed in a really positive way if we're open to adjusting to that change, because the only consistent in government is change. And the thing is too, community changes as well during that time.
Yeah.
Society changes. Now, as society changes, that means we've also got to adapt and adjust our policy settings as well, because we're not dealing with a static issue. The underlying issue might be similar or the same, but this is where the diversity of view, the diversity and individuality of thought is so critical, because what may be relevant today may not be relevant in a month's time. If we look, so for example, through a fiscal policy perspective right now, we've had 2 interest rate hikes because inflation's rising because of a war in Iran. The policy settings that were being set up 2 years ago, there was no way they could foresee that. So you've got to pivot and adjust. And it's okay to pivot and adjust, because we want the world to become a better place, but we need to go step by step by step. And again, we need to do it together. We can't do it in isolation. We as Aboriginal people can't do it in isolation, and government institutions can't do it in isolation. We have to do it together.
What advice would you give to people who want to make a difference in the system?
You never know where you will end up in 5, 10 or 20 years' time. So never forget who you actually are. Never forget the lessons and the relationships that you build on that way through. By never forgetting who you actually are and what your values are as an authentic human, as an authentic leader, and maintaining those relationships means you don't get lost in the system. And so as you move and progress through your career, you can still operate within the system, but you can look at it objectively. And by looking at it objectively, with each step, you have more influence. Someone once said to me, when I was young, they said, "Oh, Brendan, you're the most ambitious and talented Aboriginal staff member we've got here." And I looked at them and I said, "Look, thank you. I understand what you're trying to convey, but it doesn't come across right." And he said, "It's a good thing." I said, "From a non-Indigenous perspective, it is a good thing." For me, though, the higher I go, the more I can influence and change the system for the better. I said, I'm not chasing promotions for the sake of chasing promotions. I'm chasing ability to influence and reframe things.
When he said to you, "You're the most ambitious and talented Aboriginal staff member," why didn't he say you were the most ambitious and talented staff member?
Because that's the ethnocentric view that we function within society and institutions. That person was such a good person. He remained a friend of mine for decades later, but it shows and it highlights that even though people are good people, if they're not coming from the right frame of reference, they're not hitting the right target. And this is the problem and the challenge with society, because society has created these institutional beliefs. This is systemic discrimination, unconscious bias.
I've got a question. What matters most to you in the work that you're doing?
That's a really good question. As Aboriginal people, we're storytellers, and you're probably gathered by my answers.
You're a great storyteller.
So I'm going to tell you a story. Aboriginal friend of mine. He used to be a manager. He's one of my best friends. Loved working with him. Longest serving Aboriginal SES officer in the Australian government. And I remember he said to me, "Brendan, what's your ultimate career goal?" I stopped and I thought. I said, "When I die, thousands of people come, not to mourn my passing, but to celebrate the legacy that I have left behind." And he said, "But that's not a career goal." I said, "My career is part of who I am. My career is part of how I influence and drive that reform and change." About 6 months later, he came up to Uncle Solly Bellaire's funeral with me. And we were marching. There was a street march from the Redfern Aboriginal Medical Service down to Redfern Park. And I think it was the day before the 25th anniversary of the Redfern Park speech. They had the state funeral there. And as we're marching down and the hearse came in, and they had trucks there with LED screens flicking through pictures, and there was a picture there of actual Uncle Solly and I. He looked at me, he said, look at that, brother, look at that." And I said, "They're watching over us." And then he stopped and he looked around, he said, "This is what you were talking about." I said, "Exactly." Uncle Solly was one of the greatest men that I ever had the privilege of knowing and learning from. And I encourage people to read about Uncle Sol Blair. That day, we were sad that he was gone, but we celebrated what he did for us, because we wouldn't be who we are. We would not be where we are in life if it wasn't for him. And I think that there was actually an article written in the Sydney Morning Herald at the time that said, "So much of what we have is because of him." And that was the title. For me, it's the legacy we leave behind. Knowing we leave the world a better place than when we got here, and knowing that there's been honour and integrity. People come together to pay their respects for that legacy. That is my ultimate goal. There's an old Aboriginal proverb, but it basically says, we're all visitors to this time and this place. We're here to learn, to grow, to love, to teach, and then we go home. And we all have to go home and sit with our ancestors at some point in time. It's the legacy of what we have done. It is the path that we have walked that will determine not whether we are remembered, but how we are remembered.
Brendan, thank you so much for spending some time with me.
That's all good. I reckon you and I'll do a few of these over the next while.
Oh, I'm sure we will. I'm sure we will.
Did that give you...
That gave me heaps.
I hope it gave you more than what you thought you'd get.
100%. I knew from the times that we've talked before that you're an amazing orator.
I've also got so much knowledge, and I pivot and I adjust, and I always bring things back to certain messages. I'm an enigma because I just always believe in being authentically me. It's funny, Mum used to say Mum was non-Indigenous. Mum used to go, "Brendan, you're so politically savvy." And Dad would look and go, "He's shithouse cunning."
Two ways of looking at the same thing.
It's same thing, exactly. But yeah, apparently I'm a walking encyclopedia of Aboriginal affairs.
Go figure.